Mentioned to talk about UCLA on the show, and it's been a whirlwind of a season for UCLA, right? Because you go into year two with Deshaun Foster with some cautious optimism, right? I mean, they had a solid enough recruiting class. They're kind of finding their way in terms of recruiting within the state of California and competing against a USC team that was trying to find its way back after a turbulent season. You had Nico Iamaleava come in, who transferred from Tennessee, extremely talented, a guy who I think in many ways was going to be the vocal point of the offense and just the guy who can just elevate the team altogether. And unfortunately, all those things just really didn't go their way. And it all kind of started, or really the decline happened versus New Mexico, right? Where I guess in hindsight, New Mexico actually finished 9-3 this year, almost making a Mountain West title appearance. So shout out to them. But when you get beat by that much, especially on your home turf, that was kind of the writing on the wall that everybody kind of realized that although Deshaun Foster is a good guy and he means well, it was just too overwhelming and it wasn't really the right spot for him to be in. But shout out to him too, because it's a difficult enough job or circumstance to be in, especially since Chip Kelly dipped off so late into the cycle. But nevertheless, they're coming off a rough loss to USC, and then obviously got spanked the week before versus Washington, 3-9 record. But they did knock off Penn State though, so there is a little bit of a silver lining there, especially since Penn State is going to a bowl game this year. But when I look at this UCLA holistically going into 2026 season, there's a couple different things that kind of come to mind. I'd say first and foremost, the conversation with UCLA always is how do they beat USC? How are they out recruiting USC? How are they being able to get players that USC perhaps is overlooking, or how can they expand the pipeline outside of just California, the Los Angeles area in general? And according to on three sports, UCLA actually boasts a number 57th ranked class for as of 2026, and it's applicable since by the time you guys see this, signing day will be on the 4th. So we'll kind of see what ends up transpiring there, but a lot better than people thought. I mean, you have 18 total commits right now. Approximately 50% of them are in state. Now, not as good as last year, so at least from what meets the good in other guys and Kenneth Moore, who's going to be a wide receiver for them, 5'10", 160 out of Stockton, California. And you also have Camden Jensen, who's a big 6'7", 220, super athletic guy, another 4-star kid that you have coming to you too. So there is some optimism there, and we'll see kind of how it transpires. But a lot of these kids have been committed for a minute now, so there's definitely a lot of positives there. Now let's turn our attention to just the overall season itself, right? Because there's a lot of different angles that you can kind of take this from. First off, you got to feel for Nico, man. I feel for him as a football player, and to a degree, I feel for him as a human being too, because I think a lot of the drama surrounding him was definitely stirred by his father, who thought that he can poach some more money out of Tennessee. Then it turned out that that was just simply inaccurate. And much like Ethan Garber's dealt with last year, there was just no offensive line whatsoever. I mean, he was just getting pummeled over and over and over again. And there's a reason why Nico was, getting hurt a lot of the time. I mean, I think for as many times as you see Nico's ability to be super athletic, he's got incredible arm talent. He can throw the deep ball, but when you don't have that many playmakers on the roster, you just don't really get to see that very often. I think Jerry Neuheisel, realizes that and definitely tried to figure that out. I think even Tino Sinceri before, well-experienced quarterbacks coach and offensive coordinator too, who was at Indiana before and went to UCLA. So they had the right talent surrounding him to try and kind of develop him a little bit more too, because I think the one thing that you have to love about Nico besides his arm is that he's not afraid to use his legs to make plays. He's the type of guy that you can kind of trust, whether it's a third and medium or a third and long, and he's always gonna do his best to get out there and go above and beyond, right? But at the same time, he can only do so much. You know what I mean? Because there's times where Nico rushes for 50 yards a game and they kind of have a chance to win, but then there's also just as many times where he's scrambling out of the pocket and just getting sandwiched by two guys coming off the edge. So I would almost argue that the offensive line was worse this year than last year. And quite frankly, I don't even know how that's possible given last year's stats. But when you let those opposing defenses, those edge rushers, penetrate so easily and get so much pressure, I mean, how much blame can you possibly put on Nico, right? Which unfortunately he'll probably end up transferring and going to a pretty elite school. But the good news that you do have going for you is, you get a fresh, clean slate for UCLA in terms of, historically speaking, in terms of the football program. They are relatively patient with their coaches. Jim Mora, Chip Kelly, Rick Neuheisel, Carl Durrell. What all those guys have in common is they all got at least 5 seasons at UCLA, and they're all relatively experienced. But UCLA decides to go in a different direction, hire Bob Chesney, current head coach of James Madison, who is on the precipice of probably making the college football playoff this year. So that's a whole nother conversation in terms of whether or not he was right to dip out on his team. But although a lot of people are giving him a lot of credit for them making the move, especially since the early indications was that he was going to end up at Penn State, I think you have to have I have a lot of issues with this hire. As much as I think Bob Chesney is a solid coach, I don't think it's a good fit for UCLA. And quite frankly, I would argue that there's better fits for UCLA than Bob Chesney. I'd say first and foremost, something that you can't really overlook if you're UCLA is he's never coached on the West Coast. And I understand that because of the NIL, because of the transfer portal, that the geographical ties aren't necessarily as important anymore, especially when you play on the East Coast and in the Big Ten. But at the same time, when a lot of your fan base and you realize how big of the rivalry is versus USC, I really would like to see a guy who has either at least coached on the West Coast before, can build a staff on the West Coast, or somebody that has shown evidence that they can recruit on a high level. And Bob Chesney has not proven anything. The only thing he's proven is that he won at Holy Cross and James Madison, which historically speaking have been pretty mediocre programs. I mean, James Madison definitely has been, pretty relevant since they went to the Sun Belt. But if you look at years before that, I mean, they were a higher ranking FCS team, and Holy Cross, I mean, nobody really cared about that program before he got there. But nevertheless, I mean, you just can't be that excited about it too. And also shout out to Tim Skipper too, who has probably been one of the only coaches I can really recall where he's been an interim coach for 2 straight seasons now. He was the interim coach at Fresno State last year when Jeff Tedford had some health problems. Then he jumps in for Deshaun Foster. So shout out for him for riding the pine and doing the best that he can in a really unfortunate circumstance too, especially when he has to know going into this year again that he really isn't going to get any sort of real credit or recognition or, anything like that, unfortunately. But when you look at the lack of geographical, you know, complementary, yeah, when you recognize all of that, when you realize that he hasn't coached anywhere near the Big Ten whatsoever. It just doesn't really seem like it makes a lot of sense, especially when there's other people on the board that you can go after. So if I'm a UCLA fan, I would not be very excited about this hire. They do have a lot of defensive players that they could have an attempt at retaining. For example, Scooter Jackson is a defensive back that I think is super talented, somebody that I think is underrated, and somebody that will probably get. Believe he just entered the transfer portal, so that's super unfortunate. Uh, 44 total tackles, leads the team with 2 interceptions. I'm really a huge fan of him, and also I really like Cole Martin too, defensive back, 65 tackles on the year. So many different things that didn't work out for UCLA this year, particularly on the offense side of the ball. That definitely kind of is what mainly gets looked at, right? Because when you look at the wide receiver room, no wide receiver has had more than 3 touchdowns, and no receiver had more than 510 yards this year. The offensive line continues to give up sacks, and therefore you pretty much eliminate the play action entirely from your playbook, because you're pretty much asking Nico to be a circus clown and expect him to create something out of nothing. And especially when he's your leading passer with 13 touchdowns, 7 interceptions, when he's your leading rusher by at least 150 yards, it just puts you in a severe bind. And I think for those of you who follow UCLA, who cover UCLA, I think it's just going to be a very difficult time for them. And I don't think this Bob Chesney hire makes a lot of sense.